T-minus 3 days until my presentation. Getting a little bit nervous, it's getting a little real, but you know what? I'm starting to plan my prezi. Got my textbook. Here we go. Finishing up my prezi for my presentation tomorrow. I'm gonna go grab some Starbucks and let's see how this turns out. Thank you guys for coming. I'm gonna try to teach you guys on what I've learned about media, corporate power, and journalism. So, does anyone know what mass media is? It's okay if we don't. Mass media is the means of conveying information to large public audiences, but in a way that's cheap and effective. So, how do we get our mass media today? There's like these are the major ways that we get our news. Social media is like obviously the most. I would say they say 62% of the population of social media today, and of those 62% of people, 44% of them like say that that's like their only way of getting the news. The newspaper, about 20% of people, cable television, 20%, and radio, like 30%. Yeah, it just gets bigger. Okay, so the internet is like the fastest growing way of getting your news in today's society, just because it's super, you can post whatever you want, whenever you want. It really opens up access for like 24-hour news cycles. And you're able to talk to people from all over the world, people who agree with you, who don't agree with you. It just goes a lot faster. Social media and politics have like changed the game when it comes to it. Politics, just because we're able to disagree with people really, really fast. Politicians are able to speak to us like directly, especially on Twitter. Facebook is really big for like older generations, and Twitter for younger generation. And then YouTube is big for like political commentary and talking back and forth. And Instagram, don't really know what politics you talk about on Instagram, but. And also, the crazy thing about social media and politics is that it's a huge generation gap. So like the younger generations, like our group, like college age students, they mostly get it from social media. And that means that we get to choose like what news we want to hear. So we usually like to choose ideologies that are similar to us and that support our own opinions. And we don't really like to look at opinions that are different from ours. It's pretty interesting just because we have the option to eliminate opinions that we don't agree with, which kind of limits our own worldview, but people, like in the older generations, they don't really have that, and they read both sides of the news. And it's something really interesting is that we've like never been more connected. Like, we're able to hear news from all over the world at literally any point in time, but we don't actually know anything. They say like older generations of Americans actually know more about like the political process than younger generations, even though we have a lot more access to information, which is kind of crazy. Okay, so television politics is really interesting because television is usually a way of like entertainment, but politicians have started to go onto the news as a way of like seeming normal and like relatable to the public. So here's like our current president with Jimmy Kimmel, and then last president on Saturday Night Live, and they're like trying to relate to the masses more. And what used to be a thing was like they called them like talking heads, just like people staring at the camera and recording. So who owns these networks? Okay, so there's basically only 6 huge corporations that own like almost all of the news. Does anyone know any of them?
Fox, CNN,
AT&T. Yeah, AT&T is one of them. AT&T, Disney, Viacom, CBS, Google, and Comcast. So AT&T now is like the biggest one, and it owns like $200 billion. So basically, even like these like Bravo's owned by Comcast, which is owned by like it's just I have all of them, and then it goes out. I don't know. That was wild to me because all of these are worth billions and billions of dollars, and we trust them with our news, which is where we like get all of our information. And so knowing where your information is coming from and who owns it really affects the news that we're getting. Why does it matter? Consequences. Okay, the first one is commercial bias. So basically, these companies are trying to make money. The best way to do that is to like put a catchy title on it, or like to make it seem like something really big is happening. And then also, it changes the way that like they choose what to cover. They're trying to make more money so that they get bigger advertising, so they continue to make more money. Another one is there's a reduced emphasis on political news. This is like especially true on cable news. Like for older generations, they basically just talk about the weather and sports and the like weather. And then like in between that, they'll be like, also this happened in politics today, but like some actual weather. It's like, okay, clickbait is really interesting, and I put examples on here because clickbait is basically like, it's a catchy title that makes you want to click it, and then none of it is actually true. Like if you actually watch these videos, they weren't even close to dying, so that's just interesting. And it makes the information seem more attractive. They like put a really catchy title that doesn't actually have to do with the content that they're presenting. Okay, so then corporate alliances, it makes smaller newspapers not feel comfortable sharing the real information because it could hurt their like head company. So that's why it might affect the information you're getting. All right, competition. A really important thing now to know is that information is like readily accessible, like 24 hours a day news cycles, and that might mean that journalists have to choose between getting all the facts or posting first. So it might mean that like journalists are posting things that are wrong, or they don't have all the information yet, but they're too worried about their time that they jump to conclusions and they post something even though it might not be right or they don't have the whole story yet. Okay, sweet. So who are the journalists that are reporting? So every journalist has like they have four main characteristics that they have to do to make sure that they keep the news like ready, and it's really important that they have all these qualities. So they are the gatekeepers, so they decide what's going to be covered and what's not going to get covered, which is super interesting because what they decide to cover gives attention to it, which makes like people want to either donate to the cause or like they want to help, and they see like that is what's important and like that's what people should know about. The disseminators, they get the facts, they move to the news quickly. They have to make sure that like the journalists have all the information correctly, but also quickly, because if they're too late, they'll miss the scoop. But if they go too early, people won't trust them. The interpreters or the investigators are the ones that like actually like go deeply into like problems with the government, stuff that might not be so surface level. The public mobilizers, this is like the aspect of they're trying to develop what they think the community would be really interested to see. Okay, so the demographics of journalists. This has really changed in like the past couple of years because there's a lot more female reporters than there used to be, but sadly a lot of journalists tend to be white, man, and well-educated, because you have to have a pretty good education to go into this. What's really interesting about that is that usually well-educated people tend to be more liberal, so they have to like kind of balance between like their own ideologies and like posting like factual and trying not to be biased, but that actually causes people to be more conservative online because they're trying to like overcompensate for their own views, but they end up being more critical. The demographics of journalists don't really represent the whole population. Like there's 85% are white and only 33% are female, as we're trusting them with our information, and really female reporters are more likely to go into more female issues. So like if we don't have enough female journalists, no one's going to really investigate female issues as much as them. Also, that there's not as many conservative like journalists. So 31% of the population is liberal and 31% is conservative. But if only 19% are conservative journalists, then they're not really being as represented as the whole population is. Okay. Anyway, so it goes into the whole idea of bias. People really trusted the news until like 1980s. And then the Conservative Party found that they weren't being really represented enough, so they started making really conservative like radio stations and news stations. And in response to that, liberal news started like popping up because they wanted to kind of fight the conservative news. So now we have a very like polarized. What's the word I'm trying to use? Polarized government, which is like news. Like you know if it's a liberal like news station, and you know if it's a conservative station like in the first 5 minutes, which is interesting. And it's interesting because especially now on social media, like we don't check anything else, like we just kind of like look at the news and we accept it, and we don't really like want to see news that don't agree with our ideology. So we tend to like our bias has gotten a lot worse when we move on. And that goes into the whole idea of customizable news, which is like the idea that like we choose what we want to see. So if we want to see more liberal news, we'll like look for it. If we want to see more conservative news, we'll look for it. And we'll believe what we want to believe and not really what might actually be true. And this is like the whole idea that like if you only see what you like reaffirms your opinion, you don't really know what's going on. So an example is when the Democratic Party believed that Bernie Sanders was going to win and like be the Democratic nominee for the presidential election, and he lost because like it's really like a feedback loop. Like you only see what you want to see, so you don't really know what's really happening. It can be really dangerous. All right, so this goes into the whole idea of creating a political narrative, which is the idea that it's a way for the corporations to tell the public what their own values are. So it gives their values to the generation that's watching it and to the people that are watching it. So first, it needs to set a political agenda, and this is by when they choose what they want to report on, they're saying what's important. So when they're like, this is important to us, this should be important to like the public. That's that whole idea. And it sends a message to us that if we see it on the news a lot, we know it's important. But if we don't see it on the news, we don't really know what's happening. And then the way that they frame a problem is the way that we see it. So if we see American casualties, we'll think that a war is bad, but if we see it as an American victory, we'll see it that we're winning. So we should keep going. So if we focus on the negative, it goes it's almost like a feedback loop. Like if we see things as negative, we want to fix it, but if we see it as positive, even if it's the same thing. It's really interesting. Political communicators, these are the people who are the talking heads of the news. So we trust them explicitly because they have fancy dress or a suit, and we're they know what they're talking about, they know more than I do, and so we'll trust them even if they're not really correct or they don't really know what they're talking about. And their bias can heavily impact our opinion. Okay, sweet. So citizens in the media, that's us. So the media are supposed to be teaching us. So we don't really have as big of a voice to these corporations as we think we do. And they're supposed to be listening to us as a feedback because their job is to teach us, and they don't really listen to our problems or our criticisms, and they just kind of keep doing what they always want to do. And we have freedom of press, but we're not guaranteed access to the press. We're supposed to be trusting them with our information, but they don't really listen to us and what we want. Okay. The internet really created this idea of citizen journalism, which is when people are able to make their own websites, or BuzzFeed or Huffington Post or all those Vox kind of things, is people have their cell phones, they're able to record things, and they see things that are wrong, and they will send it to these places that give attention to it, which is the whole idea that people will use the internet for their own advantage. That's all I got for you.
As you can tell, most of my participants really enjoyed my presentation, and I'm glad that they were all able to attend. People also seemed to learn a lot from my presentation.